This is part 52 of wcf video series. In this video, we'll discuss configuring wsHttpBinding to use transport security mode and basic client credential type. By default, out of the box, wsHttpBinding uses message security mode and Windows client credential type. In this video, we'll discuss customizing this wsHttpBinding to use transport security mode instead of message security mode and basic client credential type instead of Windows client credential type. The MSDN link right here contains all the system provided bindings and their security defaults. If you look at the wsHttpBinding right here, notice that the default security mode is message. Let's customize this to use transport security mode. Let's flip to Visual Studio. Let's first create a new project, and we want to create a project of type class library, and let's call this Simple Service. Let's delete this class1.cs file that's auto-generated, and to this project we want to add a new item, and the new item that we want to add is the wcf service, and let's call our wcf service Simple Service. Let's change the name of this operation contract to get message, and we want this operation contract to return a string, and this operation contract expects a parameter of type string. Within the simple service.cs file, let's go ahead and implement that operation contract, and all this operation contract going to do is concatenate the word hello with whatever name that comes into this function and then return that string. Alright, so we have our wcf service. Now let's go ahead and host this in IIS. We discussed hosting wcf services in IIS in detail in part 29 of the wcf tutorial. So to host the wcf service in IIS, right click on the solution, add a new website, and let's navigate to C drive because that's where we have our simple service solution folder. So simple service. So within C drive we have simple service, and within that simple service solution folder we want to create another folder called simple service IIS host. Click open. So it's asking us, the simple service IIS host folder doesn't exist. Would you like to create this folder? Yes. Click OK. So a website is now created for us. Now let's go ahead and first build the simple service wcf service. So build succeeded. Now the first thing that we need to do is add a reference to this simple wcf service within the website, and to do that, right click on the website and then select this option, add reference, and then select the project Simple Service, and notice that it has put the simple service DLL within the bin directory. Alright, the next thing that we need to do is delete this iService.cs and service.cs files. We don't need them. And then let's go ahead and change this service.svc file to simpleservice.svc. And then let's get rid of this code behind attribute. And then here we need to give the fully qualified name of our simple service. So if you look at this simple service, the namespace is simple service and the class is simple service. So the fully qualified name is simple service dot simple service. Okay. Alright, now let's go ahead and configure an application folder within IIS. To get to IIS, within the run window, type inet manager. So that should bring up IIS. Expand the root node and then expand sites, default website. Right click on default website and select this option, add application, and let's give an alias. Let's call it simple service, and then let's select the ASP.NET version 4.0 application pool, and then select the physical path. So the physical path is the actual folder where we have our website. So our website is present in C drive, and the solution folder is simple service, and within that we have simple service IIS host. That's the physical folder where we have our website. Click OK. So we have our website created. Alright, so now within the web.config file, we need to specify the configuration that is required to host this WCF service in IIS. And to speed things up, I have already typed the required configuration. So let's copy the config and then paste it within web.config file. Now, if you look at the endpoint right here, the address is Simple Service, and notice the binding. We are using wsHttpBinding, and we have not customize this binding in any way, which means we are using the defaults. So the default security mode for wsHttpBinding is message, and the default client credential type that it expects from the client application is vendors. Okay, alright, let's save the changes for web.config file, and now let's go to IIS, and then let's right click on the simple service application that we have created and select this option, switch to content view. So we should see simple service.svc file. So right click on that and select this option, browse. So this should launch your browser, and then it's trying to navigate to simple service.svc. Notice that we have the WSHTL document. Now let's go ahead and create a client application. So I have another instance of Visual Studio running here. Let's create a new project, and this time we want to create a Windows Forms application. Let's call this client, and let's drag and drop a button control onto this Windows form, and then let's change the name of the button to something like BTN call service, and then let's also change the text to call service. Alright, the first thing that we need to do here is add a reference to our WCF service, and to do that, right click on the reference folder, add service reference, and this is the URL where our service is available. So copy the URL and paste that within the address box, and then click go. This should discover our simple service. Let's change the namespace to simple service, and then click OK. So this should generate the required proxy classes and the configuration for us. And now if you look at the configuration that is generated, first of all, notice the address of the endpoint. We are using the HTTP endpoint, and then the binding is wsHttpBinding, and the binding configuration is this one, which points to this element right here. And if you look at the security mode, look at that. The security mode is message, and the client credential type for message based security is Windows. Okay, so it's using the defaults right now. Okay, now let's go ahead and enable message logging as well for this WCF service. And we discussed enabling message logging and tracing in WCF in detail in part 9 of the WCF tutorial. So let's go ahead and quickly enable message logging, and to do that, click on Tools and then select this option, WCF Service Configuration Editor, File, Open, and we want to open the config file, and we want to open the web.config file that's present in Simple Service IIS host website folder, and select Diagnostics folder, and then click Enable Log Auto Flash and Enable Message Logging, and then navigate to this message logging option, and then set this log entire message to true. Close, save the changes, and reload the changes into web.config file. So we have enabled message logging right now. Okay, so now let's go back to our client application, and then click this button to generate the click event handler, and then let's create an instance of our client application. So it's simple service, that's the namespace, simple service client. Let's call it client equals new simple service client, and this client has got a method called getMessage, which expects a parameter of type string. Let's pass Prajim as the name, and then whatever message we want we get back, we are going to display that using a message box. So message box.show whatever message we get back. Alright, so now let's go ahead and run the client application. Let's click call service, so we should get the message back. So hello Prajim. Now obviously this message should have been logged. So now let's go back to our WCF service, open the website project folder in Windows Explorer. There we should have web messages.svc log. Let's double click that to open with the Windows Service Trace Viewer. And if you look at the last message right here, notice the body of the SOAP envelope. So the body of the SOAP envelope is encrypted because by default it's using message-based security, and the entire message is encrypted here. Okay, now let's see how to customize this wsHttp binding to use transport security instead of message security. Okay, and the first thing that we need to do here in order to configure the binding to use transport security is create a SSL certificate. And how do we do that? Using IIS. Okay, so get to IIS, click on the root node, and then actually right click on IIS and then select to switch to features view. So we get to the features of this IIS server, and then underneath here, underneath this IIS, you should see something called server certificates. Double click the feature, and then on the right hand side you have create self-signed certificates. Again, we have discussed creating self-signed certificates in part 101 of the ASP.NET tutorial. So let's go ahead and create a self-signed certificate, and let's call this self-signed certificate maybe Venkat-PC. Click OK. So a self-signed certificate is created for us. Now let's click on default website. At the moment, if you look at bindings right here, okay, we only have HTTP binding. Now since we want to use transport security with wsHttp binding, we're going to use that using SSL over HTTP, meaning we need HTTPS binding as well. At the moment we don't have HTTPS binding, so let's go ahead and add HTTPS binding. So select the type as HTTPS, and look at the port number. By default it assigns 443, and if you remember, we have just created an SSL certificate, but that's a self-signed certificate. So let's go ahead and select that self-signed certificate and click OK. So we have an HTTPS binding created as well. Click close. Okay, so now we have two bindings, that is HTTP and HTTPS. So now let's get to our website, and then within the features window underneath IIS, make sure that you have your website selected. So here we have this SSL settings. Now let's get to this SSL settings, and then let's say we require SSL, and we are going to accept client certificates, and then let's click apply. Okay, the changes have been saved now. Alright, so these are the changes within IIS. Now let's get back to our simple service, and then within the web.config file, now let's customize this wsHttp binding to use transport based security and then basic client credential type. And to do that, underneath system.service model element, let's include a bindings section. So we use binding section basically to customize a given binding. What binding do we need to customize? We want to customize the wsHttp binding. So we get into that element and then give your customization a name. So let's call it wsHttp. And then what do we want to customize? We want to customize the security mode. So set security mode to transport. Okay, and then since we are setting the security mode to transport, let's go ahead and select transport element and then set client credential type. So instead of using Windows client credential type, we are asking it to use basic client credential type. Okay, so we have customized the binding, but the next step is to associate this customization with the endpoint that we have. So here we have an endpoint. So how do we associate that customization with that endpoint? Using this name right here. So the name that we have given to this customization is wsHttp. So let's go ahead and use the binding configuration attribute and associate that customization with this endpoint. Alright, let's save the changes, and then now let's go back to IIS, right click on our simple service website, switch to content view, and then let's try to navigate to this URL. Okay, so this is there is an HTTPS error. Click proceed anyway, So security settings for this service require basic authentication, but it is not enabled for the IIS application that hosts this service. So basically what we need to do is we need to enable basic authentication within IIS, and to do that, get to IIS, select your Simple Service website, and then here you should find authentication. Double click that to open the feature, and notice basic authentication at the moment it's disabled. So let's go ahead and enable that. Okay, so basic authentication is enabled now. So now let's go ahead and refresh this window and see if we get away with that error. So now we have a different error. What is the error saying here? The HTTP get enabled property of the service metadata behavior is set to true, and the HTTP get URL property is a relative address, but there is no HTTP base address. This error is rather a misleading error, but basically to get this to get rid of this error, all we need to do is, at the moment we are expecting HTTPS. Okay, so what we need to do is within the web.config file, so if you look at the max behavior here, we are saying HTTP get enabled equals true. So let's actually change that to HTTPS get enabled equals true. Okay, and then let's come back, let's actually save those changes, and then come back to the browser window and then reload this page. So at this time, look at the URL, it's using HTTPS, and then look at the service utility, again it's using HTTPS. Okay, so let's copy that URL. Now let's go back to our client application and then delete this service reference. And then let's re-add a reference to our wcf service. So notice that this time we are using HTTPS instead of HTTP, because we want to use transport security. So we are using the transport layer to provide confidentiality and integrity for our messages. So click go, and basically look at this. We have got an error dialog, a security alert dialog here. Basically it's saying that the security certificate for host Venkat-PC does not match the name of the page you are trying to view. That's basically because here we are using localhost, but the name of the certificate that we have used is Venkat-PC. So let's go ahead and specify that. Click go. Now look at that, we don't get that error, that alert basically. So let's go ahead and specify Simple Service as the namespace, and then click OK. Now if you look at the config that is generated, so again we are using wsHttpBinding, but look at the address now, it's using HTTPS address now. Okay, and then this is the binding custom configuration item name. And if you look at this item, now notice the security mode, it's using transport security mode, and look at the client credential type for transport security mode, it is basic. Okay, so both the customizations, whatever we have applied, they are applied in the config file. Okay, alright, so let's go ahead and run the client application. So click call service and let's see what's going to happen. Now look at the error message we get. The username is not provided. Specify username in client credentials. Now if you recollect the authentication that we are using, it's basic authentication, meaning we need to provide client credentials, okay, to the WCF service. And the way we do that is when we click this button, we are creating an instance of the proxy class. So to provide client credentials, we use the client proxy, and then this has got this property client credentials dot username. So on this computer I have a user called Tan, so we are going to use this user account, and then the password is Tan. So username dot password is Tan. Alright, so let's go ahead and run the client application right now. Click call service, and look at that, we get the message as expected. Alright, and obviously this message is also logged, so let's go ahead and view the logged message. So let's refresh this page, let's open the service log, and if we navigate to the last message here And if you look at messages element, now look at this. The SOAP envelope body is not encrypted. Why? That's because the security now is implemented at the transport layer, and by the time this message has arrived to this message log, it's already decrypted, and that's why we see that in plain text. So this basically implies that the wsHttp binding is using transport security mode and basic client credential type. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.